Hey parents, in this video, I'm going to teach you about the number one thing you've probably never been told about that is probably in the background driving your child's issues with chronic ear infections, gut issues, immune challenges, behavioral challenges, and more. Stay tuned. We're going to dive in and get to the bottom of this. I want to introduce you to this big word called subluxation. This word is going to be the focus of our entire conversation today. And parents, once you understand this, you're going to understand exactly what is happening in the background in your child's brain and what really is at the root. Hi, I'm Dr. Scott Haggerty, and in my 11 years in practice, the one thing that I've realized is that most parents are never ever told about this thing called a subluxation, but I can tell you that in our experience and the things that we do as pediatric neurological chiropractors, it is the thing that is going on in the background that is driving almost every condition that we see kids coming through our door with. So let's dive in and talk about what this thing is, right? If you've ever seen a chiropractor before, you may have heard this term, but if you haven't, a subluxation is you can essentially say it's like stress built up in the nervous system that the nervous system can't release, right? And let's talk about how this works. So a subluxation can occur from birth process, from trauma, from injuries, from any type of a stressor that gets into the nervous system early and often. And in the background in a child, when this occurs, we find the most common place that it occurs is as a part of a birth process, birth trauma. Because oftentimes what's not really understood by a lot of the parents that we meet is that there is a significant amount of force that goes into the labor and delivery process that can create a tremendous amount of stress and potentially an injury to the upper cervical spine of a baby, because the baby's brain is really, really heavily dependent on being called by this sense called proprioception. When we get normal motion in our upper neck, so that motion triggers a response in our brain to tell us where we are called proprioception. So when we get normal motion from an area of the spine, that motion helps to calm our central nervous system, organize the sensory input coming into our brain, and activate a system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming, organizing force within our brain and our nervous system that also regulates rest, digest, growth, development, healing, motility, cognitive function, so on and so forth. It is the single most important system within the entire body, but it's the one that the majority of the parents that we have met have never, ever heard about. And here's the thing, right? The parasympathetic nervous system is heavily counterbalanced by the system called the sympathetic nervous system. And if you've never heard this term before, the sympathetic is the fight, flight, stress, and anxiety division of the nervous system. The brain runs the body through these, and it uses the spinal cord to communicate those messages back and forth to all the organs, glands, cells, muscles, and tissues. And so let's take a step back to birth process, right? In a standard birth process, there can be lots of stress, strain, trauma, and especially the greater the interventions increase the amount of force, stress, strain, and trauma that a baby can go through. I mean, most parents that I talk to are not aware of the amount of force that goes into a standard vaginal delivery. And parents, if you've never heard this before, you're going to be shocked. So per the American Academy of Obstetrics and Pediatrics, in a standard vaginal delivery, right, no interventions, the amount of force they use is between 20 and 40 pounds of axial traction and lateral bending. That means you're picking the baby up right here, strap a 40-pound weight on their feet, shake them back and forth, right? That's the equivalent amount of force they are going through during a standard labor and delivery. So now, if you ask yourself, could that potentially cause an injury? I think most of us would say yes, because that is a ton of force for a little baby's neck to be going through. Now, keep in mind, right? That right there is the starting point for almost everything that we see coming through our door, because the one thing that has changed more than anything else is the fact that there are way more interventions that are happening during labor and delivery than ever before. We're at a stage now where about 88% of all labors and deliveries have some form of an intervention. That intervention can range from having an epidural to Pitocin to increase the force of the contractions, to having cesarean sections, which really, really ramp up the force. Like, now, we talked about force before. In a standard cesarean section, the force ranges out between 40 and 80 pounds of axial traction and lateral bending and rotation on that little baby's cervical spine. So think about that. That's a crap ton of force that's going into a baby's neck. If you add in a vacuum extractor, the amount of force is going to go up even more. There's studies that have been shown that the force with a vacuum extractor can range up to as high as 100 plus pounds of axial traction on a baby's cervical spine. So now think about that. Pick the baby up, 100 pounds, swing it back and forth. Think about that. Is there a possibility that there can be an injury that can occur, even if there's not a fracture, right? Don't have to have a fracture for there to be an injury. If you've ever been in a motor vehicle accident and you've had a whiplash, Didn't break anything, but there sure was an injury that your neck went through because of the force of the whipping action, right? Well, imagine traction. Traction can have the same force, right? You're talking lots of force going into the baby's neck with no stabilizer muscles like you and I have. But it can cause this tremendous amount of subluxation stress to build up in the nervous system that they cannot shut off on their own. And that's a big deal, because now what you're dealing with is the equivalent of what you go through when you've got a headache, right? Because if you get a headache, right, and you know what I'm talking about, is whenever you get a headache, you're getting this background noise in the brain where your sensory system is on overdrive. All the lights seem brighter, the sounds seem louder, everything seems amplified. Maybe you get some vertigo, maybe you get some nausea, all these things, right? This is the exact same area that drives the subluxation in the background in the baby, right? The upper neck is where most headaches come from, and it's the same area that's affected in babies by birth process. This upper neck region, the brainstem, is an area that is highly sensitive, and it's also very unstable. So it is very likely to sustain an injury as a result of force in the birth process. So when you talk about this, right, imagine that your baby may be sitting in the background with the same kind of stuff you get when you have a headache, right? The amplified sensory input, right? So sights seem brighter, sounds seem louder, maybe seem a little crappy and irritable, maybe you're nauseous. Oh wait, would that be the same thing as when a baby is spitting up a lot? Possibly. Because what ends up happening is that it's the same thing, right? Set aside the pain, right? Set aside the headache. If your baby is dealing with all this in the background, ask yourself a simple question. Do you think that this could have an impact on their neural development? Do you think it's going to have effect on their cognitive development? Do you think it's going to affect their emotional regulation? What about their behavior? If you were dealing with this yourself in the background and you were asked to sit in school, do you think you'd be able to focus and pay attention and concentrate in class? It'd be really hard. I can tell you, because I was one of these babies. So I was an intervention-based baby, C-section, like really rough, and I dealt with all this stuff. I never realized it. It wasn't until I actually got chiropractic care myself that I actually learned how to focus and pay attention, because my nervous system was on overdrive. But as a parent, I watched this happen with my own daughter. So she had a very difficult labor and delivery, lots of force, lots of interventions, and she struggled mightily for the first 4.5 years of her life until we learned what it took to help her. And guys, I can tell you, one of the biggest things that I wish that I would have understood early on is the impact that this stress had on this really delicate neurospinal system here. Because guys, it's crazy how important this neurospinal system is to the brain, because the brain itself doesn't do the operations without input. You need the input from the neurospinal system to get the brain the messages it needs to grow and develop. And this is really where it goes off the rails. If the child's brain is getting all of this background noise, all this stress from subluxation right from the very beginning, it is going to derail their brain's ability to heal and focus and think and organize, right? It's actually why I have this saying up here on my walls here in the practice, right? Because subluxation robs the body of its ability to focus, think, organize, and heal. That's at the core of everything when it comes to neurology, is the brain is an input-output system. And if we can't get normal input to the brain, then there's absolutely no way the brain is going to be able to perform normally the way that we want it to. You know, that's why it's so often we see this when a child comes in and mom and dad will say, hey, you know, my child is dealing with all of these issues with, you know, well, in particular, we've seen a lot recently with kids having a lot of regulatory issues with things like vomiting. And so it's still the same thing, right? Nerves only have 3 primary modes of operation. A nerve can be hypotonic, right? Low tone. So that would be like slow or low motility, right? It can be normotonic. I eat and digest things the way that I'm supposed to. They move from esophagus to stomach to small intestine to large intestine out the back door at the normal pace. Or they can be hyper. Well, hyper can express in a few different ways. A hyper nerve can mean I can't digest my food, so I eat, I get that food into the stomach and it ejects it. We reflux it, we spit it out. We vomit because the nerve is hyperactive, or it might move faster than what it's supposed to. So I eat that food, I try to digest it, but all of a sudden I've got diarrhea or I'm not fully digesting the foods, because the nervous system in different ways can be very hyperactive. And if this is your child's case, hopefully this is starting to make some sense. But if your child is dealing with other issues, right? Things like sensory issues or emotional regulation issues, right? It's still the same pathway of stress in the background. A hyperactive fight or flight nervous system is going to derail the brain's ability to adapt to stress. It's going to mess with focus and attention. It's going to mess with behavior, all of these things. because the nervous system cannot be in growth and protection at the same time. So if we've got subluxation here in these critical areas, like the brainstem that's driving stress in the background, it's going to dramatically affect the way that our brain is able to process everything in our sensory world, right? I mean, imagine trying to sit in class and all you've got is rock noise playing in the background. You're not going to be able to pay attention, but that's the equivalent of what this does. Because neurologically, so a calm nervous system, when you get proprioception, dampens everything back down. It's called attenuation. It's the brain's ability to dampen down the background noise, the background sensory input. The problem is that if you're not getting the calming input from the proprioceptive system, you get this other thing called nociception. And what nociception does is nociception acts as a disorganizer to sensory input. It activates the fight or flight system, and it can lead to pain. It doesn't have to. But it can dramatically alter the brain's ability to process any and all sensory information coming in from the environment. And so the longer that it sits there, the more that it trains the brain to be good at being stressed. And so that's why you watch symptom evolution. Kids that have early subluxations, you see that it's the spit up, it's the colic, it's the constipation, it's the fact they're crappy sleepers and that they, need lots of proprioceptive stim to be able to go to sleep at night. But as they get older, that evolves into temper tantrums and meltdowns, and they're not sleeping at night and they can't shut their brains down. And, maybe they're having trouble with focusing at school, and hey, they're becoming anxious, and maybe they're stimming a lot. And hey, they like to crash into things because they need so much stimulation, or they always want deep hugs, or they always want pressures, or they're, chewing on their fingernails constantly. They're walking on their toes, all these things. All of these are signs that the brain is not getting proper amounts of proprioceptive stimulation, so they're seeking it in other ways because their brain is not getting what it needs naturally like it's supposed to. So, as a parent who went through this, guys, I can tell you when I had this unpacked for me, this whole perfect storm, right? That's really what it is. This whole concept of a perfect storm is really important because this is what happens, right? Once subluxation gets into a child's nervous system, it brews and it builds. And it starts to build momentum within a child's nervous system, creating an evolution of symptoms over time. So if you've been told they'll grow out of it, but they don't grow out of it, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse, this is why. Because the perfect storm brews in their nervous system, and it starts to evolve into new symptoms. That's why a colicky baby turns into temper tantrums, turns into recurrent ear infections, turns into behavioral issues at school, turns into issues with learning, turns into sensory processing problems, turns into all these things. Because the nervous system is just going from one thing to the next developmentally as the nervous system's stuck in stress and the new symptoms continue to evolve and present. And by the time they're teenagers, they're starting to experience severe anxiety and maybe some depression. By the time they're adults, it's depression, it's inability to regulate their moods, it's they're up and down all the time, it's maybe they're stressed, maybe they're anxious, maybe it's severe anxiety because it's always evolving. And this is the path of the nervous system. The nervous system always wants to be efficient. It always wants to try and do the thing that's path of least resistance. The problem is that when you've got this stress in the background early, it'll build up. And if you don't do something to stop it, then it'll continue to build. Now, I can tell you, parents, when we first were exposed to this, the doctor, Dr. Tony Ebel, who taught us about this, really opened our minds to what was going on. But one of the biggest questions we said is, okay, now that we know that subluxation is present within our little girl, what do we do? How do we actually help this? And he said, what you need to do is you need to start doing neuroscans. And he said the neuroscans are going to be the key for you being able to figure out what is going on inside your daughter's nervous system. I said, neuroscans, what are these neuroscans? And so what he did is he explained to us that these neuroscans are a technology package that allow us to look at a child's nervous system and actually see the things that they can't tell us, right? Because when we looked at these, and I'll take you on a walkthrough of some of these so you can see this. So the technology here allows us to be able to look inside of a child's nervous system in a way that you've never been able to do it before. So I'm going to switch here over to the other side of the camera. So guys, this here is what's called heart rate variability. So now this can be done in a few different ways. So this right here is the probes that we use to put the fingers in. Now we don't oftentimes do this with kids, right? A lot of times with kids, we will use like a finger cuff or an ear clip that can be put on so that we can get a measurement. Now, what this allows us to do is to be able to measure the child's autonomic nervous system. So we can measure that fight or flight and rest and digest response. And this becomes a big deal because this gives us a very direct window into how your child's nervous system is directly adapting to the stress they're being exposed to. What I love about this test in particular is that when you start looking at this, right, the nervous system is really kind of designed to balance. And so if the nervous system can't balance a stress response and it starts to teeter-totter towards the sympathetics, that's when you start seeing symptoms start to begin to present and evolve over time. So when we look at the HRV and we see the nervous system is stuck in sympathetic stress mode, it tells us our distance, how far we need to travel from where they are in terms of the amount of stress in the nervous system to where the nervous system is where it should be for optimum development of the child's brain. Okay, so we look at this very heavily right from the get-go, because if we know that the nervous system is stuck real hardcore over here on this sympathetic side, then we've got to get this parasympathetic nervous system activated via the vagus nerve. And if you know much about the vagus nerve is the key to brain function. All you got to do is go into Google, type in vagus, and you will see tons and tons of articles talking about the vagus nerve influence on brain function. Heck, go to pxdocs.com, which is the parent website for the organization that we are a part of. They've got tons of articles on the vagus nerve and its impact. The vagus nerve is the key to calming the central nervous system, improving brain function, improving gut health, improving emotional regulation, improving sensory. Every research article out there tells you that the vagus nerve is the key to the growth and development of a child's brain. So when we do the adjustments, right, we are stimulating the vagus because it directly affects the brain's input from the body by stimulating the vagus and the frontal lobe. So they begin to refire, rewire, connect, and start to heal. Now I'm going to jump forward into another test here because I want you guys to see this one here too. So this next test over here, guys, so these guys right here, these are part of what is called an EMG. Now what these little EMGs do is they are scanners that allow us to measure the direct electrical energy coming from these things called proprioceptor muscles. Now, proprioceptor muscles, they're what drive the normal input to the brain and organize the sensory messages coming up. If we have abnormal proprioception, we have abnormal output from the brain. So this is a big one because we as the chiropractors look heavily at this because the proprioceptive input system is what is going to create the stress response or the calming response within the nervous system. If we have normal proprioception, brain's calm. If we have abnormal proprioception, the brain is going to be stressed and have a very difficult time processing the sensory world around us. So we use this tons. And some of the graphs that we get from this are just phenomenal. And I can tell you as a parent myself, the very first time that I saw my daughter's EMG graphs, it was mind-blowing. Because one of the things that I had learned is that these patterns on these EMGs, they tell you everything about what a child's getting in the background. Like if you have a child that's super hyperactive and you're saying, why is my child so hyper? Why can't they shut down? An EMG graph will be able to go and see all this energy. Because what's nice about it is the graphs, they show us, here's a normal range of energy, here's your child's. And I can tell you if a child's dealing with hyperactivity, we tend to see graphs that could be 100, 200, 300, 400 points above normal because the brain is just getting bombarded with too much energy and too much noise. So of course you can't expect a child to be able to calm down if their nervous system is just dealing with tons of noise in the background. I'm gonna switch over and show you one other test here. So this here is what is called a thermal scanner. It's a thermal camera. It's a really neat piece of technology that tells us a tremendous amount of information about what is coming from the brain down the spine. Now, what's neat about a thermal scanner is that when you do this thermal scan, okay, what it does is it's rolled up and down the spinal column. Now, I want you to understand this because the way that this works is that once it captures the thermal map of the spinal cord, here's what it does. So all of the information is sent up into the system. The thermal map, right, comes out from a comparison. So the system has a range of normal that the brain is supposed to have coming from the brain down the spinal cord out to all the spinal cord nerve roots. Now, the autonomic nervous system, when it's really calm, the brain is really calm, then what ends up happening is that the output from the spinal cord is in a very small range of normal, meaning that it should be super symmetrical, it should be very balanced, there should be very little difference from side to side. But guess what we tend to see? When we look at these graphs and kids who are coming in with big stress in the nervous system, we tend to find that these graphs end up being very asymmetrical, very imbalanced. The output from the brain is very dysregulated. The term is technically dysautonomia. That incorrect input, the disafferentation altered input, creates this dysautonomia, which dysregulates the way the brain is able to regulate the output of the spinal cord nerve roots. And then what ends up happening is you start seeing that there's these patterns. And what's nice about this is that when we look at these graphs, they can tell us, are the ranges above normal, below normal, equal to normal, how asymmetrical they are from side to side. And once we understand that, it can tell us how big the pattern of stress is within the nervous system, so we know exactly what we need to track moving forward. And what's nice is when we start looking at the graphs, they allow us then on a monthly basis or a regular basis to be able to track that the brain is changing and refiring and rewiring the way that we expect it to. See, listen guys, I love this piece of technology here behind us because one of the biggest things that it's done, and I could, from a parent's perspective, is it enabled me to see within my daughter's nervous system the things that she couldn't tell us. Because when she was having meltdowns and tantrums and behavior issues and anxiety, there was nothing that I could do to get inside of her head to find out what was causing it. But when I finally saw what was happening because I had a way to quantify it, it was the first time I understood the impact that these subluxations were having on her nervous system and why she was having meltdowns and tantrums and why she was having anxiety and why she was stimming all the time. Now, guys, I know that many of you may resonate with this. This might be your story. This might be your child. Okay. So if this is something that resonates with you or you know somebody that would benefit from hearing this information, please share this with them. That is going to be my biggest and foremost thing that you asked. If there's somebody you know that needs to hear this, help them. Because I know the great blessing that we had is that the doctors who trained us helped us to help our little girl and now has helped us to help hundreds and hundreds of kids over the last 8 years to improve their quality of life through neurologically based pediatric chiropractic care. The only way that we would have ever learned about this was from social media. My wife found out about this from posts on Facebook from other people who are helping kids like we do now. That's why if you look at our social pages, right, we share stories because we need to inspire hope in the parents who are looking for this stuff. So if you know somebody that's got a child that's struggling, share this with them because they may need to hear this information just as much as you do. Okay. So the second thing that I'll tell you is if you want to learn more about this, you can go to our website. So if you go to the blog section at elitefamilychiros.com, you're going to see blog information here that's a companion to this post. Because we want you to have every piece of information available so you can understand the impact that subluxation has on neurological development. I know once you really start to unpack this and you dive deep and you start putting the pieces together, every parent that I've ever talked to has continuous ahas, thinking, holy crap, why was I never told this before? I was told all this time they'll grow out of it, or I was told that, I need to make these dietary changes or whatever, and it never worked. Once you understand the neurological impact that subluxation has, it'll all make sense. And it'll also make sense to you why so many kids come in here with all these great big patterns of stress and behavior and longstanding issues. They start getting adjusted, and in a matter of months, it's an entirely different circumstance. They're living a better life, their nervous system's calm, they're happy, focus is better, ear infections are gone, whatever it might be. Because we fixed what was driving the problem, not just masking the symptoms. Guys, hope this was helpful. Go to elitefamilychiros.com, take a look more at some of the information, and make sure that you share this with anybody that you know that would benefit from this. All right, God bless you guys. We'll see you on the next one.